I'm like, I don't want to make this movie if it's not going to be better than the first one or interpretably different. I think people can watch both and like them both or hate them both completely differently. Like either, I don't think people have to sit there and compare and be like, oh yeah, it's a better film than the first one. I think it's just inherently feels different.
Talking with you again, and excited to do so. I mean, you heard me gush about Malum the other day, but
All lies, of course.
of course. Why would I say anything true? No, it's awesome.
Thank you.
And of course, and we talked about why you wanted to back into this world, but was there any part of you that almost wanted to hand the reins off as far as directing goes to someone else for reimagining this story and world?
I mean, I don't think so because we never really approached it that way. Like, I think when Luke and I were talking, it was because we wanted to do something together. Like, so it was kind of like, he wanted me to direct, I wanted him to produce. It was like, so I guess we never really even thought about like, hey, let's bring someone else on to direct this. So it was just, we wanted to collaborate and the Welcome Villain guys thought like this made sense for their first kind of original film. So yeah, no, I ain't giving it up yet.
Well, no, I'm glad you didn't. I liked that you brought a fresh vision to it, even though it was yours in the first place. So with that said, then, I mean, we talked about expanding the lore a little bit last time, but I'm curious, how much of this lore did you and Scott have already from the first film coming into this one, that maybe wasn't explored?
Zero. Yeah, I mean, it was, and I remember, I think I was more, the way Scott and I write together, we're collaborative and we have strengths. We have our own strengths and weaknesses and they make up for each other when we decide to write together. So I'll be like, he'll do this and I'm like, you handle the dialogue here. I'm going to handle the mythology here. And because like the horror and because I'm directing it, the horror gags are I'm very specific about how they need to play out. And the cult, I gotta be honest, the cult stuff did not come together until I have to say 3 weeks before we started production.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, because I just was not everything that we were, and I don't know if we talked about this before, but in last shift, you got a very little amount of them, and it was very, we were like, oh, it's going to be like kind of a satanic cult a bit, and they're worshiping Payman, and his last name is Payman, so he thinks he's this deity, and Payman's a real, not real, but like he is something that exists. The king of hell is a terminology that exists. And we wrote that in 2013. And then when Hereditary came out, he did that too. It was Payman, it was the king of hell. It was a similar voyage to the end of the movie of like trying to, you're actually this vessel for this king of hell. So going into, I was like, well, I'm not going to do that again. I'm like, yes, we did it in Last Shift, but I don't want to be compared to Hereditary. I mean, Hereditary hit a much bigger, a much more widestream audience than Last Shift did. I didn't want anyone comparing, and I love Hereditary. I love that movie. And I didn't want anyone comparing this movie to be like, oh, they ripped off Hereditary. And so going in, I was always really adamant about, no, I want to create our own mythology. I want to create our own characters that make up what the flock believes in. I want to give them their own names, the flock of this terminology. But I had all these nuggets of ideas floating around, and it wasn't until the last few weeks in one of the later rewrites that I almost had placeholders. I'm like, yeah, that's a scene, but I hate that scene. Like, I hate that scene. And like, they're not saying the right things yet, but they will. And it wasn't until the last few weeks that all these little things I had kind of ruminating about what their beliefs were, really just fell into place. Like it was like click. I'm like, okay, now they seem fully formed, and there's a mythology that we just created that will be new to people. And that was really important to me, but it took a while to get there.
I like that you still landed on where you did, because it has a nice sense of ambiguity to it, as much as it does letting us know what's happening.
Good.
And so, with that said, then what was it like coming up with the design of the being? I'm trying to, like we did the other day, trying to be spoiler free, but at the same time, I got to hear about that design. It was such a cool one.
It's funny because I know, like, with my history with Clive, I know there'll always be, when you look at the designs, it's hard. It's actually hard not to sometimes design a new creature and have somebody like, oh, it's kind of like is it a bit Cenobite? Is it a bit, Hellraiser inspired, and or Clive Barker inspired? And of course, I was influenced by Clive. So it's like there's a lot in my sensibility with that stuff. But the reason behind that character, and the main one being like that Temple Baron character, and is we wanted to incorporate the design, the pentagram, very kind of generic thing we see in a lot of horror movies, witch movies. It's a, but I think, it can be, we knew we wanted to keep a version of that design from the first movie, but I wanted it to be more unique to this movie. So, and I don't know if people even know when they see it, but it all came from function. Like I wanted this, I'm like, okay, what's a way to elevate that? And it's actually ridiculous because the first movie, he has the pentagram on his face, right? But it's not a pentagram. You know why it's not a pentagram?
Why is that?
Because it doesn't have a circle, right? It's just an upside down star.
Yeah.
And so, but it's inherently, because of the pentagram, it's like, okay, it's an evil. So I'm like, this time I want to do the circle. Like I want to, it has to really be a version of this that people are going to look at it and be like, is that an homage to the other movie? So we had this design work with when it comes forward, right? And it's the upside down star in the circle. And that's the like reimagining of that pentagram emblem from the first film. And it inherently, because of that, has these kind of design elements that feel almost Barker-esque, but it all came from like function over form, really. It's like I wanted to up this design and actually have the pentagram, and some people may not even realize it unless they pause the movie or something. They're like, oh yeah, shit, that's actually this symbol that they've been kind of worshiping and stuff.
I definitely caught it.
All right, good.
Pentagram. And I didn't actually think of it as a sort of homage reimagining of the original face. But I do see the Barker influence now that you mentioned it. I did have that thought, I remember. But so then, speaking of just upping everything, I mean, this film does feel much larger than the first one. And I know that when we talked the other day, you had mentioned how the original was done on a real shoestring budget. So I'm curious, what were some of the things that you got to do on this film, outside of maybe that creature design that you were able to put together on the first film?
I think it was about, delivering on the scares and delivering on the creature effects, and knowing that when we wrote the movie, Scott and I really didn't hold back very much. It was like, and then you give it to the producers and like, wow, that's a lot. There's a lot of stuff in the script that needs to translate into dollars and cents to achieve. But I was adamant of like, yeah, I mean, we can do it. I mean, I let's get a team that's scrappy and that knows, and that can it really knows how to stretch a buck and expand on all these things. And that's what it was. I mean, the budget was, the resources we had allocated us much more time, much more diverse locations, allowed us to like live in that police station for several weeks and just really get everything we needed there and kind of live in that world, kind of set base camp up there for a long time. But a huge part of it is making sure that I don't want to make this movie if it's not going to be better than the first one or interpretively different. I think people can watch both and like them both or hate them both completely differently. Like either, I don't think people have to sit there and compare and be like, oh yeah, it's a better film than the first one. I think it's just inherently feels different. But those effects were a huge part of it for me. For an audience, I'm like, I have to deliver on these levels as they reach the end of the movie.
They definitely feel, like I said, bigger. I mean, the location alone, the second she walked into the police station, I was like, oh, this looks already far fancier than the rundown, like the rundown feel of the last one. I loved that. But so with that said, with trying to have them separate, stand on their, separate feet, was there any one scene when you were writing this with Scott that you looked to the original and said, I have to keep this in this film? Like it was the one that needed to be there.
The one that needed to be there, I felt, was the cell sequence in the towards the end of the first act with the homeless guy. Mm-hmm. I thought that was to me in the first movie, that was a very strong sequence, not only because I literally shut off the lights for like 2.5 minutes. In the first movie, you literally don't see anything for like 2.5 minutes. There's just black screen and audio, which is why I always talked about like this was meant to be a cinematic experience. And I don't know if you remember. Do you remember the Texas Chainsaw remake trailer?
Yeah. Oh yeah. With the with the photo sound. Yeah.
With the sound, like that I saw that trailer in the theaters, and there was a sequence that is just pure sound, and it was such an oral experience that I was like, man, I need to put a scene like that in a movie someday. And then with Last Shift, that's what it was. Like, just shut off the lights and let the sound tell the story. So I thought that was a really strong sequence that in this version, I wanted to do it a bit differently, but for people who hadn't seen the first movie, have that scene there. And then some of the setup stuff with the Grip character, I really liked, like him being, her first encounter with him is very similar, different, but it's all there inherently, because I just really enjoyed how she's introduced to the world. So we kept that version in this too. Those were a couple that were for sure.
I like that you kept that cell scene because it's still, I think, probably one of the two most memorable scenes for me from the original. That and the women sitting in front of the mirror and turning around and having the masks. Those were that two great scenes. And
you waiting for that scene in this? We're like, I wonder if he's going to do this mirror scene.
I was curious, and but I like how you approached everything in this film, including the cast. And I know we talked about it last time about, your wife being the only one who did come back. But so then I'm curious, what were some of the biggest things you were looking for in your lead in this one in comparison to the last one? Because this version of Lauren feels very different in comparison to the original.
Stamina, pure stamina. It's an excruciating shoot. No, but because to me the character's a lot different in this movie because of her motivations of why she's there and what she's doing. I wanted a very kind of thoughtful portrayal, almost an introverted portrayal. It's almost in the movie when the journey was the most important thing to me. I think Jessica in the first movie is you like her almost immediately, and I think you're consistently with her to the end, in a very like you're with her and you enjoy her presence in that way. Like you feel for her, and she's consistently. I think in this movie, I almost wanted to be like when people meet Jess in the first scene, or even in the first 15 minutes, I almost want people to be like, do I like this girl? How, because she's got such a big chip on her shoulder, and she's so constrained because she's got the whole world telling her she sucks, right? Like she's wrong. Your father's an evil man, and she's like, no, you're all wrong. So you're inherently like every scene at the beginning of the movie, she's like this, right? She's very stoic, but I think that's great because of where she ends up at the end, and that's that journey. And I needed someone who was gonna have that journey from beginning to end.
Well, and it's a hell of a journey that she has, quite literally. I think you did phenomenal with finding the right person to carry that torch on. For my final question, what was your favorite bit of lore that you got to expand upon in this film? Because I mean, we dive more into the cult. We see we actually see her mom, and she has a part to play in this. So like, what was your favorite bit of expansion on the lore?
I mean, I loved going to the farm, like to actually, it's like it's something that's talked about a lot in the first movie, and now to be able to not only open the movie with portions of it, but then to land smack dab in a scene in that farmhouse and shot in a, I love how that scene looks, and the location we shot it in, and it feels much different than the rest of the movie, and I really like that moment though. You get to be there with them, kind of like a fly on the barn wall, horsefly.
Like you say, it's a great scene, especially for what it reveals to the audience that I'm not going to say. But yes, I do love this film. I can't wait to really spread the word about it, and then to add it to my glorious physical collection someday in the future. So Anthony,
it's coming out on VHS too.
Oh,
doing a VHS run. Yeah,
I love it.
Hush, hush, but that's happening.
I love it. I'll support it any way I can. So Anthony, thank you so much for taking the time to chat again.
Of course, anytime. Thank you for having me.